Imagine waking up every single day, 2 hours before the sun even thinks about rising. The air is cold, biting against your skin. You stumble to the nearest water source, and without hesitation, you plunge yourself into freezing water. No warm shower, no gradual adjustment, just cold, shocking water against your body. And this isn't a choice. This isn't some wellness trend you picked up from social media. This is your life, every single day, for your entire existence. Now imagine that this morning bath is just the beginning. Before you, an entire day stretches out, filled with rituals, prayers, restrictions, and rules so numerous that you barely have time to breathe. You cannot eat certain foods, you cannot touch certain people, you cannot even walk certain paths. One mistake, one accidental brush against the wrong person, and everything you've built crumbles. You'll need to perform elaborate cleansing ceremonies just to restore what was lost in that single moment of contact. This was the reality for the Brahmins of ancient India, not for a week, not for a month, but for their entire lives, from the moment they were initiated as young boys until the day they died. And what's truly fascinating is that these weren't rules imposed on them by others. According to their own texts, these were rules they created for themselves, a cage of purity built by their own hands. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to know something. Where are you listening to this right now? Are you at home, relaxing after a long day, commuting to work? Maybe you're doing dishes or going for a walk. Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're enjoying this journey into one of history's most extreme lifestyles, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to follow along for more stories like this. Today, we're going to explore the most extreme purity rituals ever practiced by a religious group. We're talking about rules so strict that modern-day practices seem like child's play in comparison. We'll discover why these priests chose to live in constant poverty despite their high status, why a single touch could destroy their spiritual standing, and how children as young as 7 years old were thrust into this unforgiving system. The story of the ancient Indian Brahmins isn't just about religion, it's about human endurance, social control, and the incredible lengths people will go to in pursuit of what they believe is divine purity. So let's step back in time to an era when purity wasn't just a concept, but a way of life that governed every waking moment. The day began in darkness, not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom with blackout curtains, but the deep, primordial darkness that exists in the hours before dawn. This time was called Brahma Muhurta, and it wasn't a suggestion, it was an absolute requirement. A Brahmin had to rise during the 25th Nadika before sunrise. In practical terms, this meant waking up around 4 in the morning, sometimes earlier. There was no snooze button, no rolling over for 5 more minutes. The moment consciousness returned, the Brahmin had to immediately begin his ritual preparations. The ancient texts were crystal clear on this point. If you failed to wake at this time, if you allowed yourself the luxury of sleep, you were failing in your most basic duty. But waking early was just the first hurdle. What came next would test anyone's resolve. The first task was cleaning the teeth, followed immediately by the morning bath. And here's where things get truly intense. This wasn't a warm, comfortable shower. The text specifically mandated cold water, even in the depths of winter, when frost covered the ground and breath formed clouds in the air. The bath had to be taken in cold water. Hot water was considered acceptable only for the weak, the sick, those who simply couldn't manage the cold. For everyone else, Heating water for a bath was seen as a sign of weakness, a concession to the body that a true Brahmin should never make. Picture this scene. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, walks to the river or well in the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature has dropped during the night. His skin breaks out in goosebumps as he removes his clothes, and then, without hesitation, he immerses himself completely in the freezing water. He recites mantras as he bathes, specific prayers dedicated to Varuna, the deity of water. He sprinkles water on different parts of his body in a prescribed order while mentally focusing on Hari, another name for Vishnu. Nothing is random. Every gesture has meaning. Every splash of water serves a ritual purpose. But here's something that might surprise you. This morning bath wasn't the only one. The Brahmin had to bathe at least 3 times every single day. Once in the morning, once at midday before the afternoon rituals, and once in the evening before the sunset prayers. Each bath followed strict protocols. After bathing, the Brahmin had to perform Sandhya Vandana, a complex ritual involving breath control exercises, mantra recitation, and offerings of water to the sun and ancestors. The rules around bathing were incredibly specific. A Brahmin couldn't just splash some water on his face and call it done. He had to bathe in a river, lake, well, or at home using ritually pure water. If bathing in unfamiliar waters, he had to first take out 5 lumps of clay to ensure purity. During the bath, he couldn't wipe his limbs with his hands or flutter his hair. Why? Because the text stated that the human body has 30.5 crores of hair, and improper washing could pollute all the holy places of pilgrimage. Every action had cosmic consequences. After the morning bath came Sandhya Vandana, which literally means worship at the junction of time. This ritual had to be performed 3 times daily, at dawn, noon, and dusk, without fail. It involved standing in water if possible, performing pranayama exercises, and reciting the Gayatri mantra. The Gayatri was considered the mother of all mantras, and its recitation was so important that all the good works a Brahmin might perform meant absolutely nothing if he failed to chant his Gayatri regularly. The text described this routine as harsh. That's not an exaggeration. From the moment of waking until late into the night, a Brahmin's day was structured around an unrelenting schedule of rituals. After Sandhya Vandana came Upasana and Agnihotra, fire sacrifices where offerings were made to the sacred flames. Then came Brahmayajna, the daily study and chanting of the Vedas. This wasn't optional reading. This was the core of Brahminical identity, the transmission of sacred knowledge that had been passed down for generations. Following the Vedic recitation, the Brahmin had to teach disciples. If he had students studying under him, he was required to instruct them in the sacred texts. Education wasn't something you did when you felt like it. It was a daily obligation. After teaching, he had to gather flowers himself for the worship ceremonies he would perform later. He couldn't send someone else to do this. He had to collect them with his own hands. And here's where the system reveals its contradictions. Despite being at the top of the social hierarchy, Brahmins were expected to live in poverty. They had the right to beg for food, but this right came with severe restrictions. They could only take the bare minimum needed for survival and for performing rituals. A considerable portion of any gifts received had to be given as payment to priests officiating at sacrifices. The 6 traditional occupations of a Brahmin included accepting gifts and making donations. They received in order to give away. By the time the first part of the day was over, if you divided daylight into 8 sections, only 1 section would have passed. 7 more remained, and the rituals never stopped. The midday brought another bath, followed by Madhyahanika, the noon rituals. Then came Pitritarpana, offerings to the ancestors. The Brahmin would stand in water and make libations, remembering his fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers. After this came more homa and puja, more offerings to the sacred fire and deities. But the Brahmins still couldn't eat. Not yet. First came the Pancha Mahayajnas, 5 great sacrifices that every householder had to perform daily. These included Manusya Yajna, honoring and feeding guests, and Bhutayajna, which involved placing food offerings in different parts of the house for outcasts, beggars, dogs, birds, and other creatures. Only after completing all these rituals could the Brahmin finally take his meal. Think about that for a moment. By the time he could eat, it might be mid-afternoon. He had been awake for nearly 10 hours, performing constant rituals, often on an empty stomach, except perhaps for a little milk or buttermilk. Coffee didn't exist yet in India. Snacks were forbidden. Just discipline and hunger. After eating, the work continued. The Brahmin had to read the Puranas, the ancient stories and texts. Then he had to teach members of other castes their hereditary vocations, arts, and crafts. There was no time for rest or relaxation. Soon enough, it would be time for the evening bath, more Sandhya Vandana, more sacrifices, more prayers. Before sleeping, he had to perform Vaisvadeva again, making offerings at night. On most nights, he took only light food, maybe fruits and milk. On Ekadasi, the 11th day of each lunar fortnight, he had to fast completely. No food passed his lips for the entire day. And the next morning, the cycle began again. 4 in the morning, cold water, rituals, teaching, more rituals, every single day. The ancient texts themselves acknowledged that this life was harsh. They stated explicitly that if Brahmins had created these rules, it wasn't for their own comfort. The system imposed upon them a life of hardship and austerity, of utter physical and mental discipline. There wasn't a moment without work. But this daily marathon of rituals was only part of the story. What made life even more challenging were the extreme restrictions on what they could and couldn't eat. Food is one of the most basic human needs. We all need to eat to survive. But for the ancient Brahmins, eating wasn't simple. Every bite carried spiritual weight. Every ingredient had to be carefully considered, because in their world, you didn't just eat food. Food entered your body and became part of you. If that food was impure, you became impure. Let's start with the most obvious restriction. Meat was generally forbidden for Brahmins who followed the strictest interpretations of purity. But here's where it gets complicated, because the ancient texts actually contain contradictions on this point. Some of the oldest Vedic texts describe elaborate animal sacrifices where meat was consumed as part of the ritual. The Mahabharata, one of India's greatest epics, describes how King Yudhishthira fed Brahmins with various types of meat, including pork and venison, when they visited his palace. But by the time we reach the later periods of Indian history, vegetarianism had become the gold standard for Brahminical purity. The Manu Smriti, one of the most important legal texts, included restrictions on meat eating. It stated that after consuming meat, a Brahmin could not recite the Vedas. The very act of eating flesh created a temporary impurity that made him unsuitable for sacred study. However, even within the vegetarian framework, not all vegetables were acceptable. This is where things get truly fascinating. Brahmins weren't allowed to eat onions, garlic, or mushrooms. The Manu Smriti is explicit about this. It states that garlic, leeks, onions, and mushrooms are foods forbidden to twice-born persons. Why? Because these foods were considered to have arisen from impurity, born of tamaguna, the quality of darkness and ignorance. Garlic and onions were believed to grow from impure substances. Mushrooms sprouted at night and in dark, damp places, making them inherently suspicious. The ancient sages argued that these foods inflamed the baser emotions. They believed that pungent flavors on the tongue stirred up passions that a Brahmin needed to control. In Kashmir, Brahmins forbade all strong-flavored foods, including black pepper and chili pepper, for the same reason. Think about trying to cook without onions and garlic. In India, where these ingredients form the base of countless dishes, their absence would completely transform cuisine, but that was precisely the point. Food wasn't just about taste or nutrition, it was about maintaining a state of spiritual purity. Root vegetables presented another problem. Potatoes, carrots, radishes, turnips, all of these were viewed with suspicion by the strictest practitioners because they grew underground in contact with soil and darkness. Some communities avoided them entirely. The reasoning was that these vegetables absorbed impurities from the earth itself. But the restrictions went far beyond just what foods were forbidden. How food was prepared mattered just as much as what was prepared. Food had to be cooked by someone ritually pure. If a person from a lower caste touched the food, it became instantly polluted and inedible for a Brahmin. If you entered the kitchen of a high caste household and touched something, you could effectively pollute the entire kitchen. A special cleansing ceremony performed by a Brahmin priest would be required to purify it again. Until that ceremony was completed, no food could be prepared there. This created an entire system around food preparation and service. Brahmins could generally only accept food from other Brahmins or from people of equal or higher ritual status. They could eat certain types of food from lower castes in specific contexts, but this was heavily regulated. The rules varied by region and by the specific school of thought a Brahmin followed. Water presented its own complications. Brahmins had to be careful about where they drew drinking water. Wells used by lower castes were off limits. After drinking from a pot, a Brahmin had to purify it before drinking again. If no other pot was available, he had to throw away some water and then could reuse it. Even the vessel that held water carried spiritual significance. The timing of meals was equally important. A Brahmin could not eat until he had completed all his morning and afternoon rituals. This meant that his first substantial meal of the day might not come until well into the afternoon. By that time, he had been awake and active for 8 or 10 hours, performing demanding physical and mental exercises. Before eating, more rituals were required. The Brahmin had to perform prananyahotra, an offering to the internal fire. He would say a prayer and offer the first mouthful to this inner flame. Only then could he actually eat, and while eating, he had to maintain complete silence. The texts were clear on this point. Silence was recommended during bathing, during sacrifices, and during meals. Why silence while eating? Because the ancient texts claimed that if silence wasn't observed while bathing, the god Varuna would take away your strength. If you spoke while offering oblations to the sacred fire, Agni would take away your wealth, and if you talked while eating, Yama, the god of death, would reduce your lifespan. Every unnecessary word was a spiritual risk. The food itself had to be arranged on the plate in a specific way. Rice went in the middle, sweet dishes and ghee to the right, vegetables in front, other items to the left. Even the visual presentation carried ritual significance. On Ekadasi, the 11th day of the lunar fortnight, Brahmins had to fast completely, no solid food, maybe some milk or fruits, but often nothing at all. This happened twice a month, every single month, and there were other fast days tied to various festivals and observances. Fasting wasn't seen as a hardship, it was seen as purification, a way to cleanse the body and sharpen the mind. The ancient texts noted that purity of food leads to purity of mind, and purity of mind leads to stable memory. What you ate directly affected your consciousness, your ability to remember and recite the sacred texts, your very spiritual state. Food wasn't fuel, it was a spiritual substance that could elevate you or drag you down. Regional variations existed. In Bengal, some Brahmin communities had different standards. Bengali Brahmins were known to eat fish and certain meats, which shocked more orthodox Brahmins from other regions. But even there, rules existed. The meat had to be from acceptable animals, prepared in specific ways, and consumed in appropriate contexts. The irony was striking. Despite being at the top of the social hierarchy, many Brahmins lived in genuine poverty. Studies have shown that most Purohits, the Brahmins who performed rituals professionally, lived below the poverty line. They couldn't accumulate wealth because they had to give away most of what they received. They couldn't engage in agriculture or trade without restrictions. Their occupation was knowledge and ritual, and these didn't always pay well. Yet they couldn't accept just any food from just anyone. Even when hungry, a Brahmin had to be selective. He could beg for food, but only from appropriate sources. He had to eat what maintained his purity, even if it meant going hungry. These dietary restrictions were fundamentally about maintaining a boundary, a visible and visceral distinction between the ritually pure and the impure. Food became one of the principal markers of caste rank. You could tell a person's status by what they ate and with whom they ate. But food restrictions were nothing compared to the rules about human contact. Because if eating the wrong food made you impure, touching the wrong person could be absolutely catastrophic. Now we enter perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the ancient Brahminical purity system, the concept of pollution by human contact. This wasn't about hygiene in the modern sense. This was about a belief that some human beings carried inherent impurity that could transfer through proximity, sight, or touch. Let me paint a picture of just how extreme this became in certain regions. In Kerala, in southern India, the rules reached their most elaborate and oppressive form. The Nambudiri Brahmins of Kerala created a system so rigid that even other Brahmin groups were considered outside the caste hierarchy. Anyone who wasn't a Nambudiri was treated as untouchable by them. The entire Malabar region had pollution rules that European observers described as the most extreme in all of India. Lower caste people couldn't use the same paths as Brahmins. Their houses had to be built in places where they couldn't be seen from Brahmin dwellings. They couldn't breathe the same air as higher castes. And if they accidentally came too close, they would face severe punishment, sometimes including being cast out or even sold into slavery. Here's how the distance rules worked. A Nair, who belonged to a relatively high caste, could approach a Nambudiri Brahmin but couldn't touch them. and Ejava had to remain 36 paces away. A Pulayan, who was considered an enslaved person, had to stay 96 steps distant. Let that sink in. Not 6 steps, not 10 steps, 96 steps, the length of a football field. That's how far away an untouchable person had to remain to avoid polluting a Brahmin. In the most extreme cases, pollution wasn't just transmitted by touch or proximity. Even seeing a person from certain groups could cause pollution. This concept was called unseeability. There were people so impure in this worldview that merely looking at them contaminated you. They had to announce their presence so that Brahmins could avert their eyes or move away. Now imagine you're a Brahmin walking down a path. Suddenly, you hear a shout. Someone from a polluting caste has seen you approaching and is warning you of their presence. You quickly step aside, maybe even taking a side path to avoid any chance of coming too close. This was daily reality. Every journey outside the home carried the risk of accidental pollution. What happened if a Brahmin accidentally touched someone from a lower caste? The consequences were severe. He would immediately become polluted. He couldn't enter his home. He couldn't participate in rituals. He couldn't touch his family members. First, he had to undergo purification ceremonies. The basic purification involved a complete bath, not just a quick rinse, but a full ritual immersion. Depending on the severity of the pollution, this might need to be done multiple times. In some cases, the Brahmin would have to shave his head completely. He might have to perform specific penances, recite certain mantras a prescribed number of times, or make particular offerings to the sacred fire. For more serious pollution, the rituals became more elaborate. The texts describe something called santapana, a severe penance involving fasting and specific dietary restrictions over an extended period, or the lunar penance, where the Brahmin would gradually increase and then decrease his food intake following the phases of the moon. Entering someone's kitchen was a particularly sensitive matter. The kitchen was considered the sacred heart of the home, where food was prepared for gods and ancestors, as well as the family. If someone from a lower caste entered a high caste kitchen and touched anything, the entire space became polluted. No food could be prepared there until a complete purification ceremony was performed. These purification ceremonies weren't simple. A Brahmin priest had to come, mantras had to be chanted, water consecrated with specific formulas had to be sprinkled over every surface. Sometimes the kitchen vessels had to be cleaned in elaborate ways, following protocols laid out in ancient texts. Until all this was done, the family couldn't cook. They had to find food elsewhere or go hungry. The concept of pollution extended to all bodily fluids and functions. Urine, excrement, sweat, saliva, blood, even tears, all were considered polluting. After urinating or defecating, a Brahmin had to follow a specific purification process. He had to wash certain parts of the body a prescribed number of times. The texts specified that a householder should wash in a particular way, while a student should wash double that amount. Death and birth created particularly strong pollution. When someone died in the family, the whole household became polluted for a specified period. Brahmins couldn't perform their normal rituals during this time. They couldn't study the Vedas. They couldn't participate in sacrifices. After a death, they had to observe mourning rituals that lasted for days, sometimes weeks. Menstruation was considered highly polluting. Women during their menstrual period couldn't participate in any religious activities. They couldn't touch sacred objects or enter temple areas. They were often isolated in separate parts of the house. After menstruation ended, an elaborate purification bath was required before they could return to normal activities. The feet were considered inherently impure because they touched the ground. This is why touching someone with your feet was and remains a serious insult in Indian culture. It's also why shoes weren't allowed in sacred spaces and had to be removed before entering homes. The ground itself absorbed impurities and could transmit them. The entire system created a social order where physical proximity reflected spiritual hierarchy. The higher your ritual status, the larger the bubble of purity you maintained around yourself. The lower your status, the more you had to stay away from others. This had devastating effects on the people relegated to the bottom of the hierarchy. They couldn't draw water from the same wells. They couldn't walk on the same paths. They couldn't enter temples. In many regions, they had to carry brooms to sweep away their footprints so that others wouldn't be polluted by walking where they had walked. They had to wear bells or call out to announce their presence so that higher castes could move away. The contradictions in this system are stark. Brahmins positioned themselves as spiritually superior, devoted to knowledge and dharma. Yet they created and maintained a system that treated millions of people as inherently polluting simply because of their birth. The texts justified this as cosmic order, as the will of the gods, but the human cost was immeasurable. For a young boy entering this system, the rules must have seemed overwhelming. How did you learn to navigate a world where every interaction carried spiritual risk? How did you internalize the constant vigilance required to maintain purity? The answer lay in initiation. From childhood, boys destined to be Brahmins underwent a ceremony that marked their entry into this demanding world, and that ceremony itself was intense. The sun rose on what would be one of the most important days of a young boy's life. He was perhaps 8 years old, maybe 10 or 12. The exact age varied by region and family tradition, but it had to happen before he turned 16. After that, it would be too late. The biological urges of adolescence would have awakened, making him unsuitable for the pure spiritual initiation about to take place. This ceremony was called Upanayana, which means bringing near, bringing the child near to sacred knowledge, near to a spiritual teacher, near to the divine itself. It marked the boy's second birth. His physical birth had brought him into the world. This ceremony would bring him into the spiritual community of Brahmins. After this, he would be called Dvija, twice born. The preparation began days or weeks in advance. The family had to ensure that the timing was auspicious, consulting astrologers and priests to find the perfect date. They had to gather materials for the ceremony: ghee for offerings, sacred grass called kusha, wood for the fire, flowers, rice, and most importantly, the sacred thread itself. The thread, called yajnopavita or jano, was no ordinary string. It consisted of 3 strands woven together and knotted in a specific way. These 3 strands represented multiple things simultaneously: the 3 debts owed to sages, ancestors, and gods, or the 3 qualities of existence, or the 3 gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. The knot was called Brahma Granthi, the knot of Brahma, and it symbolized the binding of sacred vows. On the morning of the ceremony, the boy underwent ritual bathing. This wasn't the daily bath he was used to if he'd been following preliminary practices. This was special, transformative. Water was poured over him while mantras were chanted. The water itself was consecrated, made sacred through ritual procedures. He was being purified, prepared to receive something precious. In some communities, the boy's head was partially or completely shaved. This act symbolized the removal of past impurities, the shedding of childhood, the creation of a blank slate upon which sacred knowledge could be written. The boy was dressed in new clothes, often including a deerskin or cotton garment, symbolizing his new status as a student. Then came the central moment. The sacred fire was kindled in the mandap, the ritual space prepared for the ceremony. The priest, often the family guru or a respected Brahmin, began chanting Vedic mantras. The sound filled the space, ancient syllables that had been passed down through countless generations. The boy sat before the fire, perhaps nervous, perhaps excited, certainly aware that something momentous was happening. The guru approached with the sacred thread. He held it up, showing it to the assembly, to the fire, to the gods invoked in the ceremony. Then, with specific mantras, he placed it over the boy's left shoulder, allowing it to hang diagonally across the chest to the right hip. The thread rested against the boy's body, a constant physical reminder of his new responsibilities. But the thread was just the visible symbol. The real transformation came next. The guru leaned close to the boy and whispered in his ear the dietary mantra. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The dietary was considered the most sacred mantra in all of Vedic literature. It was a prayer to the sun, asking for enlightenment, for divine guidance to illuminate the intellect. The exact words were, Om Bhuva Sva, Tat Savitur Varenyam, Bhargo Devasya Dhamahi, Dio Yo Na Prachodayat. Let us meditate on the most excellent light of the sun, the Creator. May it guide and enlighten our minds. In some families, the teaching of this mantra was so sacred that the mother, father, and son would huddle together under a white silk cloth while the guru whispered the words. The boy would then repeat them for the first time, his voice trembling perhaps, speaking syllables that connected him to an ancient tradition stretching back thousands of years. From this moment forward, the boy was required to chant this mantra 3 times daily as part of Sandhya Vandana. Morning, noon, and evening, for the rest of his life, he would repeat these sacred words. The texts were explicit. If a Brahmin failed to perform Sandhya Vandana regularly, all his good works meant nothing. The Gayatri was that essential. After receiving the mantra, the boy was given additional items, a staff, often made from specific types of wood depending on his varna, a cotton belt to tie around his waist, sometimes a water pot. These were the tools of a brahmachari, a celibate student devoted to learning. Then came a ritual that captured the transformation beautifully. The boy approached his own mother with a begging bowl. He asked her for alms, for food to sustain him in his new life as a student. His mother, often with tears in her eyes, placed food in his bowl. Then other women of the family did the same. The boy who hours earlier was simply her son was now also a spiritual practitioner, formally beginning his education. In ancient times, this moment was literal. After the Upanayana, boys would often leave home to live with their guru in an ashram, a simple dwelling devoted to study. They would live as students, studying the Vedas, learning rituals, developing character. Even princes underwent this. They would leave palace luxury to live simply, learning discipline and spiritual values that would sustain them throughout life. The ceremony varied by region. In some parts of India, particularly certain communities that worship the goddess Durga in her fierce forms, The Upanayana included animal sacrifice. A goat would be brought to the temple of the family deity. The boy would worship the animal, thanking it for its role in the ceremony. Then the head priest would perform the sacrifice, offering the animal to the goddess. This wasn't universal, but in communities where it happened, it marked the ceremony as a serious, even frightening rite of passage. The age at which Upanayana was performed varied by caste and region. Traditionally, Brahmin boys were initiated around age 8, Kshatriya boys around 11, and Vaishya boys around 12. These ages reflected the different educational requirements of each Varna. Brahmins needed to start earliest because they had the most to learn: all the Vedas, all the rituals, all the philosophical texts. But what happened if a boy wasn't initiated by age 16? The texts were harsh on this point. After 16, the opportunity was lost. The boy would become what was called a vratya, someone who failed to undergo initiation. His status would be compromised. He might still be technically a Brahmin by birth, but he wouldn't have the spiritual qualifications of a true twice-born. After the ceremony concluded, the boy's life changed completely. He now wore the sacred thread constantly. It couldn't be removed casually. When bathing, he had to be careful with it. When performing certain rituals, he wore it in different positions: over the left shoulder for normal activities, over the right shoulder for rituals related to ancestors, or around the neck, like a garland for other specific ceremonies. The thread had to be replaced regularly, typically during special occasions or when it became worn. When replacing it, specific mantras were chanted, and the old thread was disposed of with respect, often by immersing it in water or burning it with sacred fire. If the boy violated his Brahminical duties seriously, he could lose the right to wear the thread. It could be taken away as punishment, and getting it back required undergoing purification ceremonies. The thread was a privilege, a mark of status, but also a responsibility. The ceremony marked not just maturity, but entrance into a rigid system with rules governing every aspect of life. From the moment that thread was placed over his shoulder, the boy was bound by obligations that would follow him until death. He had to rise at Brahma Muhurta every morning. He had to bathe 3 times daily. He had to maintain ritual purity constantly. He had to study the Vedas, memorizing vast sections of text. His childhood, in the modern sense, was over. But what happened when these sacred obligations couldn't be fulfilled? What were the consequences for breaking the rules that governed every moment of a Brahmin's existence? Picture this scenario. A young Brahmin, exhausted from the relentless schedule, oversleeps one morning. He misses Brahma Muhurta. He wakes at sunrise instead of 2 hours before. Or imagine he's traveling and he accidentally eats food that contained onions without realizing it. Or perhaps in a crowded marketplace, someone from a lower caste brushes against him in the press of people. What happens next? The answer depends on the severity of the violation and the orthodoxy of the community. But in the strictest interpretations, even minor violations required purification. For missing rituals like Sandhya Vandana, the texts prescribed penances. If you missed one, you had to perform extra repetitions the next day to compensate. If you missed repeatedly, you needed more elaborate purification. The Gayatri Japa could be extended. Instead of 28 repetitions, you might need to do 108, or even 1,000. For eating forbidden foods, the penances escalated based on what was eaten and whether it was intentional. The Manusmriti is specific about this. If a Brahmin intentionally ate mushrooms, Village pork, garlic, a village fowl, onion, or leek, he would fall from his caste. Fall from his caste. Think about what that means. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd been trained for since childhood, his entire social identity, gone. If he ate these things unknowingly, he had to perform Santapana, or the lunar penance. Santapana was brutal. It involved fasting and then gradually taking specific foods in small amounts over an extended period, accompanied by constant mantra recitation. The lunar penance followed the moon's phases, eating 15 morsels on the full moon, then decreasing by 1 morsel each day until the new moon, when you ate nothing, then increasing again. It took a month and left you weak. For more serious violations, like having sexual relations with someone from a lower caste, the consequences were devastating. This was considered one of the worst possible violations. The texts describe it as creating pollution so severe that it affected not just the individual, but the entire family line. In some communities, such violations could lead to excommunication. The person would be cast out, forbidden from participating in family rituals, cut off from the community. Excommunication was a social death sentence. Without your caste community, you had no one. No one would eat with you. No one would marry you or your children. You couldn't participate in rituals. You couldn't be cremated with proper ceremonies. You became a ghost, living but not belonging anywhere. But here's where the contradictions become fascinating. Despite these strict rules, the ancient texts themselves contain inconsistencies. Some of the oldest Vedic texts describe meat eating by Brahmins, particularly in the context of sacrifices. The Mahabharata shows King Yudhishthira feeding Brahmins various meats. The Manusmriti includes meat among foods that can be offered in Vedic sacrifices. Some texts even state that a Brahmin conducting a Vedic sacrifice becomes degraded if he refuses to eat meat during the ritual. This directly contradicts the later emphasis on vegetarianism. So which is correct? Were ancient Brahmins supposed to eat meat or avoid it? The answer seems to be that practices evolved over time. In the earliest Vedic period, animal sacrifice was common, and consuming the sacrificial meat was part of the ritual. But as Buddhism and Jainism rose to prominence, with their emphasis on ahimsa, Hindu practices shifted. Vegetarianism became associated with purity and higher spiritual status. By the medieval period, most Brahmin communities had embraced vegetarianism as the standard, but even then, regional variations existed. Bengali Brahmins often ate fish and certain meats. Kashmiri Brahmins had different dietary rules than Tamil Brahmins. Some communities that worshipped Shakti, the goddess in her fierce forms, maintained traditions of animal sacrifice and meat consumption as part of their religious practice. This raises uncomfortable questions about the entire purity system. If the rules varied so much by region and period, were they really divine mandates, or were they social constructions that served particular purposes? Modern scholars have debated the origins of the untouchability system intensely. B.R. Ambedkar, who was born into a Dalit community and became the architect of India's constitution, argued that Brahmins created untouchability deliberately to maintain power. He theorized that when some people rejected Brahmanism in favor of Buddhism, Brahmins labeled them as untouchable as punishment. Other scholars suggest that untouchability emerged gradually as certain occupations became associated with pollution, tanning leather, disposing of dead bodies, cleaning human waste, people in these professions came to be seen as inherently impure. Over time, this occupational pollution became hereditary, passed from parent to child, creating permanent outcast groups. What's clear is that the system created both spiritual discipline and social oppression. Some Brahmins genuinely pursued spiritual development through these demanding practices. Others used their ritual authority to maintain social dominance. The same system that produced profound philosophical insights also justified treating millions of people as less than human. Now let's fast forward to today. Walk into any major city in India and you'll see a different world from the one we've been exploring. Brahmins work in technology companies, drive cars, eat in restaurants, live in modern apartments. The old routines seem distant, almost quaint. The strict purity rules feel like relics from another civilization. But look closer, and you'll find continuities that might surprise you. In 2014, researchers conducted a survey across India. They asked people from different communities about their practices. The results were startling. 27% of the Indian population still practiced some form of untouchability. Among Brahmins specifically, the number was 52%. More than half of Brahmins surveyed admitted to maintaining untouchability in some form, whether refusing to let Dalits enter their kitchen, avoiding sharing food with them, or maintaining separate vessels for them. These numbers might actually understate the reality because many people refuse to acknowledge these practices when questioned. The real percentage could be higher. In rural areas, where 80% of India's population still lives, traditional practices are much stronger. Villages often have separate wells for different castes. Temples may not officially exclude Dalits anymore, but social pressure keeps them away. Dalits are sometimes prevented from entering certain neighborhoods or riding bicycles through upper caste areas. And violence continues. In 2020, a Dalit activist was killed for social media posts criticizing Brahmins. In 2019, a Dalit man was killed for eating in front of upper caste individuals. In 2015, upper caste people burned Dalit homes because Dalits had dared to hold a temple procession. These aren't ancient history, these are recent events. But what about the Brahmin side of the equation? Do modern Brahmins still follow the extreme purity rituals we've discussed? The answer is, some do, to varying degrees. In Kerala, the Nambudiri Brahmins continue to practice some traditional rituals. The complex Vedic ceremonies are still performed, maintained by families who've preserved the knowledge for generations. In some Orthodox households, the morning bath, Sandhya Vandana, and Gayatri Japa remain daily practices. But for the vast majority of Brahmins, especially in urban areas, the old routines have been abandoned or drastically simplified. A modern Brahmin might wake up at a reasonable hour, shower with hot water, say a quick prayer, and head to the office. He might be vegetarian by preference, but he's not worried about pollution from sitting next to a Dalit colleague at work. The sacred thread ceremony, Upanayana, continues to be performed, but it's become more of a social event than a spiritual initiation. Families host elaborate celebrations. The boy receives gifts. Photos are taken, but then he returns to regular life, going to school, playing video games, preparing for college. The thread hangs under his shirt, more a symbol of heritage than a marker of spiritual discipline. Interestingly, many Brahmins live in poverty despite their theoretically high status. Studies have shown that over half of Brahmin families live below the poverty line. This seems contradictory until you remember that Brahmins traditionally couldn't engage in many profitable occupations. They were priests and teachers, roles that often don't pay well. In modern India, where ritual services are needed less frequently, many priests struggle financially. India legally abolished untouchability in 1950 when it adopted its constitution. The document, largely drafted by Ambedkar himself, guaranteed equality to all citizens regardless of caste. Laws were passed, making caste discrimination illegal. Affirmative action programs, called reservations, were created to help historically disadvantaged groups access education and government jobs. Yet more than 70 years later, caste remains a powerful force in Indian society. It influences marriage decisions even among highly educated, cosmopolitan Indians. It affects access to opportunities, social networks, and resources. The past isn't really past. It's woven into the present in ways both visible and invisible. Religious reformers throughout history have challenged aspects of orthodox Brahmanism. Basava in the 12th century rejected caste distinctions. Bhakti poets from various castes, including some from untouchable communities, composed devotional poetry that emphasized direct connection with the divine, bypassing the need for Brahmin intermediaries. In more recent times, figures like Swami Vivekananda and Mahatma Gandhi critiqued caste oppression, though their approaches differed significantly. Today, Dalit activists continue fighting for dignity and equality. They've built political movements, created literature and art that challenges caste narratives, and demanded recognition as full members of society. Organizations work to ensure that anti-discrimination laws are actually enforced. Progress has been made, but the journey is far from complete. The question remains, why did Brahmins impose such harsh rules on themselves? If they had social power, why not make life easier? Several theories exist. Perhaps the demanding lifestyle created genuine spiritual development for some practitioners. Perhaps it was a way to justify their high status. Pace 40. They could claim superiority based on extraordinary discipline rather than just birth. Perhaps it was a competitive mechanism where communities tried to out-purify each other, leading to an escalation of restrictions. Or perhaps the system served political and economic purposes. By controlling access to rituals and sacred knowledge, Brahmins made themselves indispensable to society. Kings needed Brahmins to perform coronations and sacrifices that legitimized rule. People needed Brahmins for life cycle ceremonies, for resolving disputes, for education. The purity rules, harsh as they were, maintained Brahmin distinctiveness and authority. Whatever the original intent, the consequences were real and often tragic. Millions of people lived and died classified as untouchable, denied basic human dignity. Brahmins themselves, even those who tried to follow all the rules perfectly, lived in constant anxiety about pollution. The system created rigidity, hierarchy, and suffering on a massive scale. So what are we to make of this extraordinary story? The extreme purity rituals of ancient Indian Brahmins reveal something profound about human nature and social organization. On one hand, we see dedication that's almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Rising at 4 a.m. every single day for your entire life, bathing in freezing water regardless of weather. Memorizing thousands of verses with perfect pronunciation. Maintaining constant vigilance about every interaction, every meal, every thought. This represents an astonishing commitment to ideals, a willingness to subordinate personal comfort to spiritual goals. On the other hand, we see how easily spiritual discipline can become social oppression. The same purity rules that supposedly elevated Brahmins required degrading millions of others. The concept of ritual pollution, taken to its logical extreme, created a system where human beings were treated as inherently contaminating simply because of their birth. The pursuit of individual purity led to collective injustice. The contradictions within the system itself are striking. Texts that preach universal dharma also justify hierarchy. Rules that demand tremendous self-discipline from Brahmins also grant them privileges over others. Communities that produced profound philosophical insights about the unity of all existence simultaneously practiced the most extreme forms of social separation. And perhaps most fascinating is how this ancient system continues to echo in the present. The physical rituals may have faded for most Brahmins, but caste consciousness remains. The explicit rules about untouchability are legally banned, but discrimination persists in subtle and not so subtle ways. The past shapes the present, even when we'd prefer to leave it behind. What lessons can we draw from this history? Perhaps that the human capacity for discipline and devotion is extraordinary, but it needs to be guided by compassion and justice. That spiritual practices divorced from ethical consideration of others can become tools of oppression. That traditions, no matter how ancient or revered, must be examined critically for their impact on human welfare. The story of Brahminical purity rituals is ultimately a story about how we construct meaning, maintain identity, and organize society. It shows us the heights of human dedication and the depths of human prejudice, often existing side by side in the same system, sometimes even in the same individual. Today, as India continues to grapple with the legacy of caste, these ancient practices serve as both a reminder and a warning. A reminder of the rich complexity of Indian religious tradition, with its emphasis on discipline, learning, and ritual precision, and a warning about how systems designed to create purity can instead create profound impurity, the moral stain of treating fellow human beings as less than fully human. The young boy who received his sacred thread, who learned the Gayatri mantra, who bathed in cold water at dawn, he was entering a tradition thousands of years old. He was connecting to something larger than himself, taking on responsibilities that would define his entire life. Whether that was ultimately liberating or constraining, enlightening or limiting, probably depended on the individual and the specific circumstances. What's certain is that this tradition shaped an entire civilization. It influenced art, literature, philosophy, social organization, and personal identity for countless generations. Understanding it helps us understand not just ancient India, but also modern India, and perhaps something about human nature itself, as our capacity for both extraordinary dedication and extraordinary cruelty, often in service of the same beliefs. If you've made it this far in this journey, thank you for listening. This is complex history that doesn't offer simple answers or easy judgments. I hope it's given you something to think about, perhaps made you see familiar things in a new light, or introduced you to a world you didn't know existed. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about these practices? Could you imagine living under such strict rules? How do you think modern societies still carry echoes of ancient systems of hierarchy? Leave a comment below and let's continue this conversation. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the fascinating, complex, and often surprising ways humans have organized their lives throughout history. Because understanding the past isn't just about looking backward, it's about understanding who we are today and who we might become tomorrow. Until next time, stay curious.